all so much for joining us for this afternoon's event, The New Nepal and its place in Asia and the world, and thank you for being patient with us. My name is Anne-Marie Kernan. I'm a senior studying sociology here at UW, and I'm a founding member of the International Students Front. So that is our organization. The International Students Front, or ISF, was founded in 2017 to bring an anti-war and decolonial narrative to our campus. Last year, a few student organizers, along with myself, agreed this perspective was not represented enough on our campus, so we decided to start our organization. We aim to challenge Eurocentric understandings of both historical and contemporary geopolitical conflicts and hope to bring awareness to issues that are often overlooked. We are anti-racism, anti-colonial, and anti-war, and we are pro-justice, pro-sovereignty, and pro-peace. So when we were approached by the Nepal-based International Peace Institute to host this event, The New Nepal, we were very thrilled for the opportunity. As a country that is landlocked between two major superpowers, India and China, the voice and story of Nepal is seldom heard. Over the past 2 decades, Nepal has undergone a major political transformation, becoming a rapidly developing republic despite the not-so-distant legacy of its feudal monarchy. For over 400 years, Nepal was ruled with an iron fist by the Shah dynasty that imposed a theocracy and massive inequality on the impoverished population of the country. That all changed in recent years when the people rose up and overthrew one of the last remaining absolute monarchies in the world. This led to the country's first truly democratic election in 2008, and Nepal is now one of the world's youngest republics. It's truly an incredible story. We are so lucky that leaders of this heroic struggle have joined us today in Washington, D.C. to discuss their movement and the future of the country that they now lead. Our esteemed guest, Mr. C.P. Mainali, was a main leader of the 1971 Japa Peasants' Rebellion, a historic milestone in the fight against the monarchy. Since 2015, the people and nation of Nepal have shown to the world their resilience and strength in the aftermath of catastrophic earthquakes. And while the king's dictatorship is over, the huge task of developing the country, defending its sovereignty, and securing justice for the people is still ahead. So a reason that this meeting today is so very important is that it is something of historical in character. By that I mean, to our knowledge, an event like this has never happened in Washington, D.C., or anywhere in the United States. Today is a pioneering moment whereby the people in the United States, here in this room, get to hear directly from leaders of the people of Nepal about their own complex social and political struggles that they have been enduring. This is critically important because Nepal has not only recently emerged from a revolutionary process to form a new democratic government, it is also located in a very geostrategic sense at the center of a growing point of confrontation in world politics. The United States, starting in 2011 under President Barack Obama, as some of you may remember, initiated what he called the pivot to Asia. In broad strokes, this meant a recentering of U.S. military and foreign policy in what was then called the Asia-Pacific region, and is now labeled by the Pentagon and other U.S. intelligence services as the Indo-Pacific region. This language is calculated and signals a significant shift in U.S. military and strategic doctrine, targeting China in particular, and attempting to enlist China's neighbors into a U.S.-led economic and military bloc against the People's Republic of China. So now I'd like to take a moment, after providing this context, to thank those that made all of this possible today. So I want to give a special thank you to our co-sponsoring organizations, the Answer Coalition, also known as the Coalition to Act Now to Stop War and End Racism, as well as the Nepal-based International Peace Institute for helping bring our wonderful guests to GW today. I would also like to thank my fellow students at the Student Association of the George Washington University, whose generous co-sponsorship made today possible. I'd like to thank our other student organization co-sponsors, including the Young Democratic Socialists of America at GW and the Students for Justice in Palestine at GW, for their assistance in spreading the word about this event to our academic community. Finally, we'd like to thank the George Washington University for allowing us to use this space, and especially the workers and staff that facilitate the use of this space. So today we are pleased to be joined by Mr. Brian Becker, National Director of the Answer Coalition, by Mr. Kaphley, Director of the International Peace Institute, Mr. Hiranya Sherestha, former Ambassador of Nepal to Russia, and Mr. Chandra Mainali, former Deputy Prime Minister of Nepal and the current General Secretary of the CPNML. Before we begin, we'd like to remind everyone that we are accepting in-kind donations in order to offset the cost of this event. All proceeds will go towards our student organization. We would be greatly appreciative of any generosity, and thank you in advance. Finally, please be sure to turn off or silence all cell phones as we begin the programming. So, without further delay, I'd like to first welcome to the podium National Director of the Answer Coalition, Mr. Ryan Becker.
Thank you, Anne-Marie, and the International Student Front for hosting this event, which Anne-Marie said, I believe, is a pioneering event, literally, because no one's done it before. I think this is the first of its kind whereby leaders of Nepal get to speak directly to the American people or some sectors of the American people to be able to present their own reality. And while we have those of us in attendance, we're also recording this meeting. We are also streaming it live on Facebook. We hope to have this not simply be a one-time event, but rather the beginning of a process whereby people in America, in the United States, get to learn about this tremendous struggle that is almost completely ignored in the U.S. corporate-owned mainstream media. Anne-Marie mentioned that I'm the National Director of the Answer Coalition. 15 years ago, we organized demonstrations month after month after month, where literally hundreds of thousands of people, month after month, came out to say no to a U.S. war in Iraq, a war that we failed to prevent, a war that eventually took the lives of 1 million Iraqis. Tens of thousands of U.S. soldiers, too, were either killed or had life-changing injuries. We were in the streets trying to stop the U.S. war in the Middle East at that time. Since then, the United States and Britain and France have destroyed the sovereign government of Libya in 2011 under the pretext of protecting civilians. Imperialism always finds a way to give its wars of aggression a noble cause. It never says, we're going to Libya to exploit the land, labor, and resources, and especially the oil that Libya possesses. People wouldn't accept that in the 21st century. So they say the war is for something else. It's for a noble cause, to protect civilians in the case of Libya, or to stop weapons of mass destruction in the case of Iraq. The reason this meeting is so important, too, not only so that we learn about what's going on in Nepal, but because we recognize that the people in Nepal don't want to be the pawn on some empire's geostrategic chessboard, that they want to be their own people. They want to be the masters of their own destiny. They want to emerge from feudalism and monarchical dictatorship to genuine democracy. And the reason that is in particular importance right now is that the United States war drive, which we witnessed in Iraq and at Libya and in Syria 10 and 15 years ago, and even as late as 5 years ago, that war drive is not ending, but it is shifting. And it is shifting towards Asia. It is shifting towards what the national security strategy recently released under the Trump administration proclaimed to be the new priorities for U.S. military strategy and a new U.S. military doctrine. What is it? It's called Major Power Conflict. The new national security strategy released less than a year ago states that the war on terror, so-called, the war that was used as a pretext for the invasion of Iraq or the bombing of Libya or the intervention in Syria, is no longer the priority for the United States and for the Pentagon. The new priority is to prepare for war with China. Let that sink in. To prepare for war with China. and to prepare for war with Russia. That sounds like insanity from the point of view of what human beings need, what human beings want. It seems impossible that someone could entertain the idea that the United States of America, with $1 trillion annual budget, a country of 350 million people, should actually entertain the idea of going to war with the People's Republic of China, another nuclear power, a country where 1/4 of all of humanity lives. It seems impossible to entertain the idea that there's a rational thinking with the idea of preparing for war with Russia, the second largest nuclear power. What's the reason for this war drive? Is it that China is about to invade the United States, launch a new Pearl Harbor in Hawaii? Is it that the people of the United States have something to fear from China's peaceful rise from underdevelopment and poverty? No, of course not. There's no rational reason for the people of the United States to fear China. China does not want to go to war with the United States, nor does Russia. The Trump administration military budget, by the way, that was just approved in the last quarter, the increase in the military budget is greater than Russia's entire military budget. The United States spends more than 10 times per year as Russia on military goods and 5 times as much on China. The logic of the policymakers in the Pentagon and nearby in the State Department or the CIA is that if China rises peacefully, if it becomes a major power, that's a zero-sum game. If China wins, the United States empire must lose. China's presentation is a different formula. China says we have a win-win strategy, meaning our economic development as a country is not at the expense of the United States, that both sides and all sides gain from the possible emergence of China as a major economic force. Likewise with Russia. That brings us to Nepal. Nepal is a small country. Nepal is a country of less than 30 million people. It's landlocked. It's between China and India. The reason the United States shifted the terminology for Asia, coinciding with this new national security strategy, from the Asia-Pacific region to the Indo-Pacific region, is not simply because there's 2 oceans, the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. There are 2 oceans, and they have different names. But that's not the geostrategic reason for this new language. It is because the United States is trying to win over India and other countries in the region to be part of a united front directed by the Pentagon and Wall Street capitalism against the People's Republic of China. And as a consequence, Nepal and Nepal's desire to rise out of its own feudal legacy of underdevelopment is impossible to think about separate and apart from this global geostrategic new reality whereby the U.S. is preparing for war with China. Now, about that war, here's what retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, who was the central commander of all U.S. forces in Europe until 1 year ago. This is what he said a month ago, speaking in Warsaw. The United States needs to have a strong European pillar. I think in 15 years, it's not inevitable, but it's a very strong likelihood that we will be at war with China. This is not Brian Becker, Answer Coalition, political radical, socialist. This is Ben Hodges, recently retired as the Supreme Commander of all U.S. forces in Europe, predicting that in 15 years, the United States is likely to be at war with China. I mean, just think about this. If you would talk to people in Europe, say, in 1910, or say, go even further back, go back to 1900, about 15 years before World War I started, and said, can you imagine that the major powers in the world will go to war against each other, and that tens of millions of people will die in the matter of a few months or a couple of years? I think most people, when asked that question in Europe, say in the year 1900, would have said, no, that's not possible. No policymakers could possibly think that that would be a good idea. But 14 years later, World War I did happen. And in 4 years, 20 million people died. And 20 years after that, the Second World War happened between major powers. And that time, 85 to 95 million human beings perished in a matter of a few years. All the cities of advanced capitalist countries, with the exception of the United States, lay in smoldering ruins by 1945. Germany, France, Japan, everywhere. The magnitude of the violence so great that if it wasn't for the United States' ability to step in and save world capitalism, there is no doubt that in 1945 to 1950, the socialist revolutions that were witnessed in Vietnam and in Korea and in China would have undoubtedly spread throughout the entire world, including Europe, if it hadn't been for the Marshall Plan and the U.S. intervention in Europe. Since the end of World War II, the United States has maintained an aggressive, belligerent, hegemonic position in world politics, but it has not anticipated that the next step would be really to have a war with the Soviet Union before, or Russia today, or the People's Republic of China, but that's precisely how they're thinking right now. I mean, we have to take stock of this. This is not alarmist propaganda. This is their own concepts, their own doctrine, their own strategy, their own work in the media. When we hear about Russia meddling in the 2016 election, or as Trump now says, China meddling in the U.S. election, is it really possible that Vladimir Putin had such power, that that internet troll agency in St. Petersburg had such power that they could influence and impact the American election so that we have Donald Trump to become president of the United States? Does that explain it? Of course not. But the animus that's being directed against Russia and now China is being accepted not only by right-wing conservatives, but liberals and people who call themselves progressive, who are getting in line behind the war propaganda. And so the American people are being organized systematically in terms of their thinking to hate and fear Russia, to hate and fear China. Why? In order to prepare us for the inevitability of war. That's why we think this forum in particular has significance, because Nepal and what Nepal is experiencing is not separate and apart from the new U.S. doctrine and the new U.S. strategy. We have to think of it in those terms. I want to say one or two final points. When I was, just for people to know, I'm not only the national director of the Answer Coalition, I'm a founding member of the Party for Socialism and Liberation, the PSL, which is a Marxist party in the United States. We believe that socialism in the United States and socialism everywhere is the most important and only real alternative to the system that breeds endless war and poverty, and unemployment, and racism, and sexism, and bigotry directed against the LGBT community. We believe that socialism is, in fact, the future. Now, I was in Belgium in about the year 2000, and I met a young Nepalese freedom fighter from the armed struggle in Nepal. He was part of the armed struggle against the monarchy. And he was just recovering from his wounds. He had been in the hospital. He was probably 18 or 19 years old. And he said to me, is it true that that all the working people in the United States have the right to vote? And I said, technically, yes. And then he said, well, why don't you have a communist government then? Meaning his assumption was that if workers actually could vote for a government, they would vote for a government that got rid of capitalism and developed the means of production and the productive apparatus to meet human beings' needs rather than profit. And I explained, well, that's a long story about why we don't have a socialist government in the United States. And it is a long story. But, you know, when I think about the new Nepalese government that's taken power, I can't help but think the majority of people voted for socialists in Nepal. They voted for people who identified as socialist or communist. They have the vast majority in the parliament. There's different parties, there's different tendencies, naturally. But the people of Nepal have a representative democracy, but in that representative democracy, they're voting for very, very progressive candidates who are trying under incredible odds and in a very difficult international environment to raise their country up, to emerge from an era where underdevelopment and economic backwardness were the dominant feature, to a modern society with all of the elements of real people's democracy. And so, as we learn about Nepal, I always think back to that incident, and I think we not only have to learn about Nepal, but we have to learn about what Nepal can teach us in terms of building social justice movements. Because even though the United States is an advanced capitalist country with all of the rewards that go with industrial and scientific and technological development, it may be other countries and other people who are really in the forefront of the fight for social justice in spite of the problems of economic backwardness or poverty or the legacy of underdevelopment. So we're so grateful that we have these freedom fighters who are now central leaders in the new Nepal to come and share with us their perspective, not only on how Nepal can be independent and genuinely independent in this international environment, but also pursue the agenda that they've given their whole lives for, an agenda promoting social justice for the people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brian. Always a pleasure to hear you speak. Brian's a longtime anti-war activist. He has a lot of experience with social justice movements. So thank you so much, Brian. So with that, I'd like to welcome our next speaker, who is Mr. Kaphley. An engineer by trade, Mr. Kaphley is a longtime peace activist. As I mentioned, he is the director of the International Peace Institute, which is based in Nepal. And he will be talking a bit about how Western external influence has impeded the Nepalese movement for justice. So please give a warm welcome to Mr. Kaphley.
Good afternoon, friends and friends in Dice. Actually, I appreciate very much to organize this meeting by City University Student Union and Answer Coalition and other friends are here. And when I heard the introduction from Mr. Brian, and I really appreciate him to understand the real situation of the whole world as well as Nepal. Here is my honor to present some small background, how we face difficulties during our struggle for many decades. Even I represent relatively young people, but when I heard from our seniors, they will explain more about their own struggle for a long time. So they have at least half century experience of this struggle. Friends, it's true. The American state is doing many things out of the globe, but what happened to us is also equally very important for everybody in this afternoon, because how we suffer because of their interference and their anti-people activities inside and outside Nepal. The great people's movement of Nepal in 50s, which I was not born, but I have some reflection from there because of our seniors taught us what happened to there in 60s, in 90s, and in 2006 were a significant phenomenon, not only for the people of Nepal, but also for the South Asia and the whole world at large, which overthrew centuries-old monarchy and finally established Federal Democratic Republic in 2008. Nepal has been an independent nation and never been colonized by any power. However, because of its geostrategic location between China and India, even in post-colonial era, it has been several interference and interest of global power centers like USA and India. Even after the middle of the 20th century, when the People War, 1996-2006, was in peak in 2002, just after the Royal Massacre 2001. The US then Secretary of State Colin Powell visited Nepal first ever American Secretary of State visited Nepal. So we can see how their interest was there. He visited in 2002, January 18, and what he said and how he explained his visit, when the capitalist world was celebrating the diminition of communism with the collapse of Soviet Union, they declared the Maoist movement in a landlocked country like Nepal, which is thousands of kilometers from here, from US, a threat to United States, of American national interest. What he said, explained about his visit, first ever visit to Nepal. While speaking at the meeting in Washington, D.C. on February 28, 2003, US Assistant Secretary of State Donald Camp said, Maoists threaten US interest. The United States faces a number of foreign policy challenges around the world, and Nepal is one of this list. We keep our eyes on the situation daily. So they were ready to see our struggle daily, but in another way, how to detract defend the whole movement. And work constantly to ensure that our policies pursue the US national interest and the interest of Nepali people. How can we do from here? April 7, 2002, the Washington Post published a report on Nepal. The report said, quote, more than a decade after collapse of the Soviet Union and the East European communism, and a quarter century after China ended Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution, the mere existence of Maoist communist movement should be a straight and chilling anarchism. Maoists not only exist in Nepal but have been gradually seizing control over more and more of the mountainous nation of that time 25 million people. What's astonishing about the Maoist revolution of Nepal is that it exists at all. Like seeing a movie, monster right after this apparent death, watching Maoist rebel gain ground anywhere in 21st century, much less in an open country that hosts hundreds of thousands of tourists a year, defied belief. Then our Prime Minister, that time, Mr. Sherestha, in an interview to the Reuters news agency said that if US did not supply enough arms for Nepal, then it would take another many decades for the government to defeat the Maoists. It was our government stand at the time. Deuba, the Prime Minister, then Prime Minister, also told that India and Israel, given sophisticated armaments, in those years, anybody could easily mark the increased activities of US, UK, Israel, and India on the soil of Nepal. How they were actively, supplying arms and their knowledge to disrupt Nepalese movement as well as Nepalese society. US still feels that consolidation of left forces in Nepal will bring Nepal closer to China. And it will be against the US hegemonist design. It is still the same mindset of capitalistic forces in the post-World War II. The legacy of the British Empire in the Indian subcontinent, replaced by UN nowadays, led capitalist forces in modern times. If we look back to the conference on Free Tibet in Shimla, it was in 1913-1914, when the British Empire, India, China and Tibet were participating, and they designed to make Tibet free from China at that time itself in 1914. But the newly Republic of China at that time in 1914 rejected and withdraw from the conference to the proposal of divide Tibet into two parts and declare free. Following the British Empire footprint after World War II, how the US invaded Korea in 1950 to 1953 and in Vietnam. The US trained compass. On top of that, later in the 70s, US trained compass from Tibet, and they actually they dropped in the Himalayan region in Nepal, and we were in very difficult time because we have no any dispute with China at the time, but because of American trained compass dropped there with very sophisticated weapons to fight with China, and it ended with almost 2 years war with China at the time. Once we analyze all these activities, the US and its friend in Nepal can easily see the interest which is not in the interest of Nepal or Nepali people. Though Nepal and US had been in diplomatic relations since last 7 years, and people-to-people relation also deepening in these years, the US perception cannot be changed by our effort alone, and I'm happy to see this gathering here, and very conscious gathering, who understand the US policy around the world very much. And only change after the sovereign nations in the region and the American peace-loving people can extend their solidarity will bring the change in the present situation. The socialist consciousness in the Arab country was developing very rapidly in 50s. I'm a little bit going back to the example of Arab, how Arab is suffering now. Socialist idea has gained foot under Islamic socialism. Egypt, Syria, Algeria were turned into socialist camp, whereas the US created and backed the Islamic terror outfits to destroy all the people's struggle and achievement in the Middle East. When we see the recent activity from the Shenzhen province of China, that is in northwest, and to the Rohingya problem in Myanmar. If you see the globe, that is all comes under the Hindu Kush region, that is high mountain terrains from west to east. It reminds us the situation of Arab world in this 6 decades back was full of disasters, carnage, and forced displacement, and full of tragedy. What is happening now remind us, how US activity nowadays going on from West China to the, East China, that is close to Yunnan border in Myanmar, and in between Bhutan, Nepal, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Kashmir, Tibet, all comes, in that region, that Hindu Kush region, and their activity in different issues, and particularly they are supporting the extremists and try to radicalize the ethnic group, regional, religious group, to make the whole situation ungovernable, uncontrollable from outside. And it is more difficult terrain in our sense because this region from Myanmar to Shenzhen province in China, we call it Hindu Kush, is full of diversity of ethnic religious group than the Middle East. This is also known as the Hindu Kush. Its sensitivity into climate change context equally vulnerable and equally vulnerable in linguistic, ethnicity, diversity in the people's cultural practices. So friends, I wonder, because of all this heavy-handedness of US regime in our region, and now after hearing Brian that somebody in the US military, he just predicted that after 15 years war, now I see there is some kind of sense because of what we are feeling now and what the formal people of the Indian American Army or Pentagon or whatever is matching, and then we are really now think about the possible disaster situation can emerge in our region. For that reason, this program I feel very important, and what the George Washington University students have done, so far for our cause is as a solidarity, and this should be, much deeper in future in the real difficult time. But usually, what I find human rights group around the world, they usually interfere after something happened, like counting the head, how many people died. We don't want to be, in that situation. We want to, avoid such situation beforehand and to live our life in a peaceful and with our own, kind of determination, where people must have the right to, self-determination in our way, where we can decide our development, our governance, whatever we want. So if for the mere greed of capitalism makes us the situation what is happening in Europe is intolerable and unacceptable for us. So this meeting will, a part of the beginning of our solidarity, exchange solidarity from the US people and the US Pacific people. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Kaphley, for that wonderful speech. So I'd like to welcome our next speaker to the podium, Mr. Hiranya Sherestha. Mr. Sherestha is a former Nepalese ambassador to Russia, and he will be sharing his paper on Nepalese politics and its relation to regional and international politics. So please welcome Mr. Sherestha.
Comrades and friends, please accept greetings from land of Mount Everest and birthplace of Lord Buddha. Nepal, now we have completed three-tier election: local election, provincial election, and national election. Leftists are in majority. Not by bullet, but by ballot. Now we have new constitution and its implementation is going. So the major features of old Nepal was monarchy, unitary form government, Hindu state, semi-colonial and semi-feudal structure. Now new Nepal, that is republican, no monarchy already abolished, federal, no centralized power. There is now new federal provinces, 7 provinces are there, and Nepal is now secular country, not Hindu state, not attached with any particular religion. And the constitution, which is a joint document of Democratic and Left Party, it has mentioned that socialism-oriented, inclusive, democratic state. That is the feature of new Nepal. But very difficult to achieve in practice these goals. So as far as Nepal's place in Asia is concerned, Nepal is one of the oldest independent country of Asia. In beginning, Lord Buddha from Nepal, and the extra vaccination, they have by archaeologists found 2,800 years old artifacts in Kapilvastu, and we have now the historical property that Nepal was one of the prosperous country during an old day. So Confucius was there, Lord Buddha in Nepal, Mahavir Jain and others in India. So these all three regions are the civilizational units. Nepalese have some synthetic cultural feature also. That is, there are people of Mongolide origin, there are people of Aryan origin. So mixed synthetic culture also we have. So we claim that it is more Asian than South Asian, than North and Central Asian culture. So anyway, civilizational background in the past, and now India and China competing each other in Nepal to construct new connectivity. When China signed to construct a railway linkage with Nepal, India reacted positively that they also agreed to construct the railway line from Raxaul to Kathmandu. and they are trying to bring it more earlier than what Chinese could to bring their the railway to, from Lhasa to Shigache to Kathmandu. So it will sooner or later Nepal will turn as a transit country. And after the emergence of Xi Jinping, Chinese interest, new Chinese interest is to look big market of South Asia. So the Nepal, they have taken Nepal as a Chinese gateway to South Asia. They are looking the big market of UP, Bihar, Bengal, and other South Asian countries. So the priority is now connectivity, and it has changed geo political situation also. Himalaya is no more barrier. It was not barrier even in the old days, because there are several passes that old Nepalese monks, travelers, traders pass through, and we have very intimate trade relations with China and with India also. There are thick malarial forest in between Nepal and India during that time. So that was the period when in winter region we trade with China, and when in some summer region with China, and in winter region we trade with India. So we have seasonal trade dynamics. But now, with modern development of science and technology, Nepal is going to be one of the Chinese countries linking two big markets of the world, Chinese and Indian markets. And there is new prospect now that Nepalese market is very small, so multinationals are very shy. Now we have easy access from Nepal to Indian market and Chinese market, and there is cheap labor, there are rich resources, including hydropower potentiality is very rich. If multinational, including American capitalists and others, come to Nepal, it will have easy market for this for products in Nepal to Indian and Chinese market. So practically, Nepal is a linkage between two largest markets of the world. When the power is shifting from west to east, 21st century is going to be Asian century. So these are the powerhouses emerging. But we have very typical experiences with both our big neighbors, China and India. I can say there were 4 blockades in Nepalese history. One that is in 1962, that is known as Raksol blockade. Nepali Congress government was dissolved by the then king, and their leaders were exiled. They run hit and run against royal regime in 1960s. India supported it and imposed blockade in favor of Nepali Congress. Then China reacted on the request of royal regime that Marshal Cheney, the then foreign minister, he warned India that if there will be an aggression against Nepal, China will come to help Nepal, rescue Nepal. So blockade was immediately within 24 hours, India withdraw the blockade. And I asked the then Prime Minister, Mr. Tulsigiri, why India is so prompt, China is so prompt to speak in Nepalese favor against India. He said that. Or it is because for 2 reasons. One, it is their duty to help Nepal and expand her relation in Nepal. But the final internal objective is to neutralize Nepal during India-China border war, which is, they were in preparation. So that calculation happened, and Nepal remained neutral during Indo-China border war in 1960s. So that was first blockade, which cleared. And in 1970s, there were another blockade imposed upon Nepal because Nepal withdrew Indian military mission and Indian military checkpoint from northern border and joining with China. So India is not pleased. So they imposed another blockade, but they failed because of the Chinese and international support in favor of Nepal against this inhuman blockade. In 1989-90, there is another blockade. It is because Nepal purchased some anti-aircraft guns and weapons from China. So our India was so furious, they imposed third blockade. But that also, they supported the restoration of democracy movement, and there are political change. China was in the king's favor, and India was in favor of restoration of multi-party democratic system. So there was a united struggle between the left and Nepali Congress. So that gave momentum, and King Birendra negotiated with the multi parties and became ready to be a constitutional monarchy, then to surrender the strategic and water interest to India. So there was the worst treaty draft, but he favored democracy than surrendering national interest. And the last blockade, that is 2015-16, when there are earthquake in Nepal, we are facing very difficulty, and we have promulgated new constitution. Sushil Koirala was the prime minister, he represented Nepali Congress, and all left forces are there in the government and in the parliament. That is a consensus document of all major parties except Tarai in parties. So India was not pleased because they want to keep Nepal as a Hindu state, particularly this Modi government, which the Nepalese leader did not accept because Nepal is a multi-ethnic, multi-religious country. So we are in favor of a secular country. That's the one point which they disagreed, and why they want more power to the Tarai people, which is very similar culturally with them. But the Nepalese major parties stood united and promulgated new constitution, and it is in implementations. The major challenges, I would like to spare time for question and answer. That will be very interesting. So, present position is that all three powers, India, China and USA, their priority in Nepal is security. So Nepal had bilateral military exercises with India. Nepal had such bilateral military exercises under this Indo-Pacific Command's cooperation with USA, and now we have joint military exercise with China also. So all three major parties are trying to influence our army, which and after the abolition of monarchy, oldest institution in Nepal, Nepal army. So all these major powers are working to influence the army and running micromanagement to influence our bureaucracy and leaders in their favor. So there is macro-management is a characteristic of Nepal. So anyway, Nepal, every country has a soft belly. Tibet is the soft belly of China. Kashmir is the soft belly of India. This Jatra area is the soft belly of Sri Lanka. So Nepal Tarai is soft belly of Nepal. Because people across the border are getting easily citizenship. So Indian tactics is that make more Indians Nepalese citizens, so that within few years they can outnumber ethnic Nepalis. So there is this demographic aggression upon Nepal. Our leaders are so weak. According to present law, Nepali women if marry with Indians and go to India, they have to wait for 7 years to apply for citizenship. But in Nepal, when the Indian woman comes and marry with Nepali male, they get immediate citizenship and can be deputy prime minister, deputy president. Only head of state position is barred for naturalized citizens. So easily, so now there is a draft that he or she should not show who is his or her husband, and on the basis of being a mother, and his children can get citizenship. So, but in India, we have Nepalese ladies should have to wait for 8 years. But in Nepal, it is very easy. So even our nieces, not only the married with Nepal, the Nepalese Indian origin citizens, but easily getting those who already married with Indian boy, because 8 years they are not getting Indian citizenship. So within that period, they can be a Nepalese citizenship. So indirectly, this you can see Mexico wall here, migration issues, and we are facing very serious this immigration problem because of our open border with India. Anyway. India and Nepal, we are in between these two big powers, India and China, and they are competing and cooperating also. So it is because of Trump's trade war, India, China, Russia are coming close. Recently, this Russia arms deal with India. Nearly 60% of Indian army materials, they are from Russia. So in US is not happy. Already Mr. Ben rightly pointed out that to bring closer military cooperation to India, US changed the name, the US Pacific Command, into Indo-Pacific Command. So India, US want India, USA, Japan, South Korea, and ourselves in the Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean against China. That is his war preparation. That is very new wave of Cold War. Is here. Chinese are so pragmatic. She does not like to place India on trade and other issues, so that India will be nearer to US. Rather, to win over India, he had given certain concessions, and some new agreement once between India and China to use Nepalese territory for trade purpose. It is known as Lipulek agreement. So we have such feeling. If there is, if two elephants fight, that is a danger for small countries. If two elephants love, sometimes it makes much more difficulties to a small country like Nepal. They may turn Nepal as a condominium. Jointly managing Nepal appears, Bhutan appears between sea and body. So there is new danger. So global power should play more positively to make balance and rebalances. We are in favor that let India-China develop their relations. That's good, but not at the cost of small countries like Nepal. We don't accept condominium status because Nepal is the oldest civilizational unit, independent country, never colonized like Indians or Chinese. So they should respect Nepalese independence. We want to go against India's strategic interests. We want to go against China's strategic interests. We want our Nepalese soil to play against them. But we won't accept their joint exercise of power in Nepal. So we propose trilateral mechanism, India, China and Nepal. We can sort out the problems. So better cooperation and competition be combined between India and China. The correct terminology will be competition, but not confrontation. Confrontation will create problems in our regions. Confrontation will make India war base of the US military strategy. So it will be very difficult days even to the Indians. So India, like a very ambitious and big country. So during Nehru's period also, Chinese were making comments like that. India, after 62 war, India is not really non-aligned, it is double-aligned, aligned with US, USSR and USA. And these days also in China won't join blindly with the US or with Russia or with China, rather play because she has her own ambition and try to please big powers, dominate and dictate small powers like her. So we have the problem of our struggle for survival. Anyway, if there is better understanding between American intellectuals and we can have support from these community solidarity for our struggle for survival and rebalancing our relations with both our neighbors, it will solve the cause of Asian peace and cause of world peace. At the same time, we can make failure of hegemonism, rather economic and cultural cooperation scope is there. So this sort of interaction is quite helpful to bring intellectuals and progressive people much closer for the cause of peace. Thanks for the organizers.
Thank you so much. Now, I'd like to welcome our last speaker. We just have about 15 minutes left of the program, and then we're going to go into the question and answer segment. So we're very honored to welcome Mr. Prakash Mainali or Mr. C.P. Mainali. As I mentioned earlier, he was a key leader in the Japa Peasants' Rebellion, a turning point for the fight for Nepalese independence from the monarchy. And he has been involved in politics since he was just 24 years old, a highly respected leader in the country, and is currently the General Secretary of the Political Party. Please give a warm welcome to Mr. Mainali.
and friend Mr. Becker, leader of the Party for Socialism and Liberation. Am I right?
Yes.
And my speaker friends and young people of this University of America, young friends and many veterans of this population, expert from Nepal. I like to offer my namaste and my greetings to all of you. I'm very much happy to be here with you. Though I have been to a few more times to United States, but being in high-level delegations as a captain of hotels and the formal programs. And this time, when Mr. Kaphley informed me that there are friends in USA who are struggling for the working people and who are struggling for the socialism and liberation of people. They have much more concerns about the struggle of Nepal and Nepali people. And he informed me that this ancient coalition, the forum, the front of this Party for Socialism and Liberation, perhaps, and other student organizations and some expert organizations of Nepal here. They have organized this very important and this, the program here. And first I was a little bit hesitant whether I should come and share my views with all these important people here or not, but at last, having many times conversation with Mr. Kaphley, I decided to be here. And I heard Mr. Bine and my two colleagues. I'm very happy to share my few sentiments with you. Actually, you have decided the topics for this program as the role of the new Nepal in Asia and the world. Very, very important and very complicated subject. And actually, if to enter into these topics, I want to make you peep into the struggle and this making of new Nepal. What process were behind the movement, except the people, valiant people of Nepal who fought valiantly against autocracy and who have a very strong feeling against expansionism and imperialism. But they were they were not behind this change and behind this agitation. To know very objectively the change, I want to make you listen a few statement of some the scholars. Actually, in 1970, an American friend, Mr. Leo E. Rose, he was very much interested in Nepal and interested in international relations and the situation of Nepal. He published a book, Survival Strategy for Survival. Strategy of Nepal for Survival. And he published in 70 this book here in USA and later It was reprinted in India and Nepal too. In his conclusion, he has written in his book, one small paragraph. I want to read out it. He says, some future Indian government may well conclude that the simplest solution to a New Delhi's chronic problems with Nepal would be to replace the existing design in Kathmandu with one considered more reliable by the Indian authorities. While this would probably prove counterproductive in the long run, it could be accomplished with relative ease in several ways. He suggested these ways. He said that India may use these ways: direct intervention by Indian troops. Second, slightly distinguished intervention through the use of Gurkha units in the Indian Army. You know, the young and robust people from Nepal are enlisted in the Army of India, and it is called Gurkha Army, and they have Gurkha Army units in Indian Army. They may use these groups or ex-service being resident in India. Third, indirect intervention through support of a Nepali revolutionary movement. They can use this such movement or an all-out economic bloc. Four alternatives he suggested which could be used by our southern neighbor to control Nepal. And you know, there was change in 1950 and 51, political change, a historic and important change. Second change was in 1990, and third this one, which brought Nepal present. And second one, it is important from the former officer of the research and wing of the Indian Intelligence Bureau, Mr. R.K. Yadav. In his book, he has written a book, Mission Raw, and published in 2014 in New Delhi. In one chapter, he has written this thing. He says, the former Raw official, Mr. R.K. Yadav says, Cow, which at the time the leader of the chief of the research and analysis wing of Indian intelligence, Cow told him, meaning the R.K. Yadav, Cow told me that after the merger of Sikkim, he had a plan to disintegrate the Tarai area of Nepal. Because of increasing presence of China here, much to the discomfort of the Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. He foresaw the Maoist menace to India in 1975, which is now posing a serious security threat to India. However, merger of Tarai of Nepal was different in view of political turmoil in India, and Indira Gandhi declared emergency in the country in June 1975, just after the merger of Sikkim with Indian Union. Most of the opposition leaders were arrested by her, and internal political storm hampered her in formulating other external planning of the region. Unfortunately, when elections were held in 1977, Indira Gandhi was defeated and her party did not come to power, and Cow's operation of merging Tarai of Nepal and other assignment did not materialize. The second very important. And thirdly, though Indira Gandhi took another strategy towards Nepal, it was to disintegrate Tarai Nepal first, then control or submerge it. And later on, while we were making our constitution through Constituent Assembly, at that time, another Indian analyst and international affairs analyst, Mr. Achilles Pilla Lamari, wrote in a magazine named The Diplomat, and it was published from Japan in September 25, 2015. And Pillari writes in this article, he says that if a solution is not found, the 1971 scenario may also unfold in Nepal. The Bangladesh scenario or merger of Sikkim scenario. This would lead to the detachment of the Tarai from Nepal and its union with India. This would not at all be a bad scenario for India, since it would alleviate India's geographic insecurity by pushing its border north and further away from its heartland. The development would also widen the very narrow Siliguri corridor that connects India's northeast with the rest of the country. These three courses I already presented you. Actually, it describes the mindset of the rulers in India. And since the time of unification of Nepal, it was in 18th century, the last unification of Nepal. At the time, India was ruled by the British, and India was a colony of Great Britain. The colonial India was very much expansionist towards Nepal. And Nepal, at the time, the king from a very poor, hilly region of Nepal, Gorkha, his name is Prithvi Shah. He just analyzed the situation in South Asia that British are advancing to Nepal, and they want to, make Nepal a part of British colony, British India colony. And first of all, before unifying the divided principalities, at the time there were not less than 16 principalities in Nepal. They were divided in Nepal. Before advancing towards unifying these divided principalities in one country, he had to fight against the British Indian, their intervention. They sent British India at that time. It was called the East India Company government. They sent troops comprising 2,500 modern weaponry of that time, and we fought a war against them, and the Sinduliguri fought and defeated, Nepal defeated. And I think the defeat of Indian aggression, British Indian aggression against Nepal or against the unification of Nepal was the decisive point which made the unification successful. Since that time, British India were expansionist toward Nepal, and when they left India in 1947, and India became permanently independent, Britishers left India, but Indians did not pursue the Britishers' policy. They continued their colonial policy, and it is still dear in their mind. Actually, these three codes show their mindset. And in each every we have seen after the Second World War, we have in Nepal we have three great and important political changes. One was in 1950, 51. It was people fought against the 104 years old Rana autocratic regime, and even at that time, India was made the headquarters of the movement. That's why definitely they had plenty of opportunity to influence the institution. And there was in 1951 January, there was one agreement between the three sides of Nepal, the agitators, the ruling Rana group, and the king was expelled from monarchy, and India was mediator. It was called the First Delhi Agreement, and it brought some progressive change in Nepal together with their heavy interference. That means a political change with a heavy political corruption. And the post-war period of Nepal, we Nepalese and the leaders of the movement were compelled to struggle against that interference as well as other political development. This was the first. And second one, we had another change in 1990. It was against the monarchical, party-less panchayat system, where no party were allowed to function legally. And but at that time, the agitation was mostly the people-based, and our southern friends did not get much opportunity to come inside the movement and influence it. Even then, at that time they were imposing the blockade against Nepal, because at that time the king had bought some weaponry from China, and the purchase of weapons annoyed the Indian rulers, and to pressurize them not to do such thing, and to make excuse on the subject, they imposed us. It was their one support to the movement. And second one, when there was talk about the movement and struggle, some leaders from India came to Kathmandu and they gave speeches for the movement and against the monarchy. And it created one situation which was against the monarchy and which was for the movement. And laterally, there was a struggle, and at that time the king Virendra was wise enough. He might have thought that if the movement will prolong, they will have much more. They will get much more space to interfere. That's why he, at the beginning of the movement, he called for dialogue with the party of agitation, and he compromised, and he accepted, to introduce this multi-party parliamentary bourgeois system, as well as he accepted being under the constitution. Before that, the monarchy was autocratic and active monarchy, but after the 19th movement, King Virendra accepted the constitutional role. Even at that time, our friends in South, they had not got opportunity to contribute a lot, but with these two contributed their tasks. After the movement, they snatched some the facilities of Nepal. And last time we have this change in 2006, the movement which overthrew the monarchy. And behind this overthrow of monarchy, there is this story after the change of 1990. Though the party of agitation, Nepali Congress, itself self-styled social democratic party of democratic socialism, though they were neither very much democratic nor socialist, but they were democratic socialism. And the then Communist Party of Nepal, Unified Marxist, they could not deliver what people expected. And there was this traditional monarchy, the operation, exploitation, and there was another one party, revolutionary party named Nepal Communist Party, Maoist. And they launched an armed struggle in 1996 to overthrow monarchy, to overthrow this parliamentary system, and institutionalize the people's democracy, means communist republic. It was their immediate goal. And it was, I think it was based on the subjective analysis of the Nepal and the situation around it. The analysis of launching the struggle for communist republic, and that time was not an objective necessity and was not the advisable tactical goal, but they accepted and they fought for it. And they, after 1.5 years or within 2 years, they decided to take their headquarters of the revolution from Nepal to India. I already told that since British rule, the colonial time, this policy was colonialist, and even after 47 they were the same. And even the party who's launched the armed struggle, CPN Maoist, they would term the Indian regime as expansionist regime. Even then, they transferred their headquarters from rural side of Nepal to India. And it gave the Indian rulers much space to influence the movement. And later on, right now, it has been quite clear that they were supported by indirect means at first. They were provided shelters, they were provided, by resources, informations, weaponry, training, etc. And on such support, many youth of Nepal they joined the Maoist movement because they were not aware of the strategy of the powerful, the neighbor, and of their leadership. They didn't fought against the rulers, and they even gave up their lives for the liberation and for the socialism. But later on, when the Maoist movement, amassed enough power to overthrow monarchy, and the leaders of of India, they pressurized the Maoists and they brought in the direct table. And again there was another agreement. It is called Second Delhi Agreement, and on which based there was movement. And in 2006 there was the third victory, and up to you because you have plenty of information. But I only just suggested you to study the mind of our neighbor and their actual activities, how they are behaving with the neighbors and in the world. And without knowing their mindset, and without knowing their strategy, and without knowing their intention to help Nepal, education of Nepal, we cannot have a very, very correct judgment. There is Nepal, there is new Nepal, but with heavy pollution, political pollution. Even after 50, we had to fight against the political pollution. Every time we had to fight against the neighbors for political pollution. We had to fight against the invasion of the overthrown monarchy and established by the monarchy established by the movement. It has the great ambition to rule Nepal autocratically. We had to people had to fight against this also. We had to, because the political parties at the time were very new in the very initial stages, and political party had not much more experience. And there was fight and bickering among the political parties. These three things, ate up the energy and time of the leadership. That's why after in the post 1950s movement, we could not, the leaders could not pay much more attention. That's why the three movement, and now we have this new Nepal, and Mr. Brian has already told that after the the end of this Cold War, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, there is only one superpower, the United States of America, whose administration is an imperialistic one. You already explained it. And after the election of Donald Trump, it has become much more conservative, much more rightist, and much more against the popular interest. And you know him very, very well. We have heard about him and we are experiencing him. That's why, now the rising China is a socialist country having its own characteristics, has rise very, very astonishingly, and the second economic power, and it is third in military power. It has done many things for the people. It was the first country who is in a few years, it has brought the people from the evilest, the poverty, more than 700 million people. So it has done many things, and right now the leadership of China, they have this mega project of this OBOR, the Silk Road project, which asks for the common prosperity, win-win sharing, and which is beneficial for the peace in the world and developing common prosperity. And to check recently the Donald since for many months he has started this trade war, and if it cannot be solved through dialogue, it may take it will spill to other dimensions of the society, and it will be catastrophic. Right now, I have to mention here that for that the People's Republic of China is not only its the competitor. The People's Socialist Republic of China, they have become a new China through a very long struggle led by Washington. He fought for 28 years, established People's Republic in 1949, and after 1980s, they have started working more and building new China and their way of socialism, and they have become the change. And you know, the China being a socialist country and USA being the lead administration being of the monopolist and corporates, and it is a administration of the imperialists. That's why the competition and the relation of USA with the China is it is getting antagonistic on class basis. That's why it's very complicated one, and they want to check China its development and its the growing strength. They want to they want to push China in some sort of conflict war, and the easy way to push China in some sort of war is to launch a so-called free trade movement, and to launch push forward this movement. Nepal is most necessary for that, because Nepal is very near to the heartland of Tibet. Last time we have the all-weather passes from Nepal to China, and it is very easier to launch this movement. That's why they want to control, and they want to have their strong hold in Nepal, and it is the interest of India too. And these two powers have joined hands, and other forces which are against socialism and which other forces which are antagonist with China. The United States is trying to mobilize them, and the commander-in-chief told maybe the internal, the truth of the junta, United States, that within 15 years there will be war against China. So it's the case. And we are, and we are beneath the shadow of this war. If you American friends and the big friend, brave and wise friend of the United States of America, if you cannot check Tom and his allies, we will be plunged into war. We means Nepal. That's why new Nepal is at peril. We are not safe. Our peace, our development, our independence, our sovereignty is at peril. We are challenging. We have been challenged by these forces. That's why the new Nepal, actually the people of Nepal want to make it a new, but the imperialists, expansionists, reactionaries and their allies do not want to make Nepal a new Nepal. In Nepal, laboring people of Nepal, all people, patriotic and independent, loving people of Nepal. And this we know. And we, this time, after this election, after this the promulgation of the constitution through this constituent assembly, we have this historic election of 3 tier of government, federal, provincial, and local level. And a coalition made of this CPN UML and this CPN Marxist Maoist Center. This coalition got nearly third vote, and they are in the government. And many people who love, who are for the exploiting people and common people, they have a much more expectation from the government, from this government, which has come to power, and it is very strong majority, that it will really, this government will make Nepal a new Nepal. But the situation is not so good. If you go and to see and with the Nepal, the government is not delivering what the people have expected from them. And now I cannot elaborate much more on this thing. And these people are very much confused. They say some people might imagine that they have this the communist, these leftists, they have that great majority, more than 2/3 majority. Whether they will establish people's republic in Nepal, if they could establish, it will be very very happy thing in Nepal. But so is not the case with them, because their intention is not that to establish the People's Republic, and which is not advisable right now. And they are not doing well, but their principles and their policies, so many principles and policies are not conforming with the Nepalese situation. And on the top of that, these people are not sincere to their policies. They are not sincere to the vote of the people. That's why, even after they are in the government, people are still dissatisfied and they are losing faith upon them. And I don't say more on that thing. And as the Republic powers, states, United States and India, they are together, they have their strategic relations, and they are bring Nepal in their control. And in the days to come, we will feel we are compelled to feel their very strong intervention in Nepal. And I have in the Communist Party of Nepal, Marxist-Leninist, we are trying to have a working environment with all patriotic people of Nepal. In Nepal, there are patriotic people in communists. Some are leftist patriots, some are democratic patriots, some are nationalist patriots. We have whole category of politics in Nepal, and in every category there are patriotic people, and we, the Communist Party of Nepal, Marxist-Leninists, want to mobilize these forces in one, so that we can check the current interferences and we can work for the people's liberation, people's present aspiration. And this is the thing, and these challenges have also given us some opportunity. At that time, if the leadership will be wise enough, it can get the investment and other cooperation from other countries also, and which can contribute to the building a prosperous. That's why we have challenges of interferences, as well as we have opportunity to build a prosperous Nepal. And we are facing these two things simultaneously. And this is much to say right now. And actually, being here, coming here, I had my mind that I want to listen once more from you. What are the expectations? What are the aspirations of the American people, and especially the youth of America? How do they think, and how we can have our link and relation with these people, the great people of United States of America and the young people of United States of America, which is very meant from every country of the world. There are the youth and other living and working here, and the sentiments and the tasks done by the American people will not only be very helpful to us, it will be it will create a worldwide sentiment towards Nepal. And for this organization, for this time to share with the friends over here. I like to thank all organizers, and we will be benefited, much more benefited by settlement. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Allen, for that great speech. So for our final segment, we're going to open up the floor. We're going to have about 20 minutes for the audience who wants to maybe ask any questions to our speakers. How it's going to work is we're going to ask people to come up to the microphone that's sitting there in the center aisle. And if your question is directed to a specific speaker, please indicate who you would like to answer your question. If it's just a general question, maybe we can have one of those speakers volunteer to take it up. So if any audience members feel so compelled to come ask a question, please feel free to do so.
I'm just going to grab the mic.
Please say your name also, and if you're speaking.
I'm just going to try to grab this on the back.
Yeah, feel free to form a line behind.
Somebody else wants to.
I think it comes out of the stand.
Wow, it does. Namaste, Satyaharu. Welcome, friends. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Nepal 30 years ago, and I congratulate you, Subhas, for the recent successes of the socialist and communist movements in the country that I lived in, worked in, and came to love and continue to love. And I really appreciate the discussion, the historical, the geopolitical, all of that. The question I have is a bit more down to earth and pedestrian. As I'm sure you are well aware, perhaps the audience may be less aware, but the history of the caste system and the prevalence of patriarchy are two key features that, I know it very well from our own country with racism and the rest. But specifically, I would like to know if you could speak to the inclusion and the representation within your parties, within the parliament in general, of the Dalit, the untouchable, quote-unquote untouchable castes in Nepal, as well as women. Thank you.
Sir, good question. Was there anyone in particular you wanted to ask?
Just any general secretary, perhaps, may begin with that.
Is answering me, or I may put my question?
Yeah.
Let's take question first.
Yes.
We'll take a set of 3 questions, and then we'll answer.
Good afternoon. This is Hiranya from Nepal. I'm a visitor right now in the United States. I thank you for inviting them to speak some of the things about Nepal's present political situations. But I'm a bit disappointed that all the 3 speakers didn't talk much about what they think about New Nepal and how they conceive New Nepal can be achieved under the present constitutional or political dispensation. There are some pertinent problems very severe problems regarding the federalism and also with the problem in the Tarai, the Madesh, which is called. Mr. C.B. Mainali would have clearly told us that is the federal system working properly? Would it be in the benefit of the Nepali people at large in the long run? Or the questions about its sound functioning is being raised right at the moment. What Mr. Mainali thinks about it? Is it good system of government? It will bring about the progress or development of the country, or it has only been a burden for the treasury? That is one important question I would like to pose to Mr. Mainali. And another question is, what do you think, what does he think about the people of Madeshi origin, or the leaders of the Madeshi origin? Do they demand, are they demanding the right demands for the people, or they have been motivated by some hidden agenda? Something they are working for the benefit of, on behalf of the Indian dispensation? These are two questions, Mr. Chandra Prakash Mainali, I would like to put before you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We'll go ahead and take one more question.
Right on the front.
Yeah, we can take this. One more question. Try to keep your question like under 2 minutes, and then we'll have a round of answers.
Hi, I'm Peter. I'm a student studying GW, and I'm from China. Yeah, my question is a general question to everybody on board. Is that how can Nepal, which was a pretty religious country, maintain its secular path during its development? All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So how can Nepal, as a religious country, maintain a secular path? So let's have each of our answers for about 2 minutes, and then we'll ask for more comments from the floor.
2 minutes.
2 minutes each for you.
Wait. Mr. Mainali will reply about federalism and Madeshi problems. I will deal about the caste system and other problem of transformations in a multi-diversity of socio-economy in Nepal. Nepal is a small country, but it is a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multicultural state. So we must have multi-ethnic democracy also. Multi-party democracy is not enough. So my interpretation of multi-ethnic democracy means respect to each other, all nationalities, ethnic groups, caste, class, and regional groups. Respect to each other. They should treat them as equals. And third most important component is not as a ruler and rule, but as a partner in the system. So these three things should be clearly mentioned to make Nepal and modernize Nepal with a multi-ethnic reality. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Just I want to respond to friends from Nepal. As actually, you should not be disappointed about the leading of Nepal. Actually, I especially, my party and most of the Nepalese, they do not believe that all political problems of Nepal have been solved, and there is only one question of economic development is only partially true. There are so many political problems in Nepal. Our independence, sovereignty, our integrity, geographic unity, it is in challenge. We have so many national interests to be safeguarded by the southern neighbor. I don't want to elaborate, and time doesn't permit me to do so. And there are many questions of how we can give identity to all ethnicities. Geographically making province according naming province and making province ethnicity is quite impossible in Nepal. But there must be, the state must recognize the identity of all ethnicities. It is not being done by the present constitution. And we should go for a market-oriented social development. We should build a social capitalism which is based on market economy, and it is some sort of mixed economy. And basing on this principle, we must endeavor to develop our national economy, and we can take help from the friendly countries of the world, which will we should accept all those assistance or loan or aids which will help us, our economy, make our economy strong. And that's why we have this thing in our agenda to bring to build a new Nepal. And actually, the Madhesi people are very much patriotic people of Nepal, and they have their role in unifying Nepal in the 18th century also. But the leaders of the party and leaders of Madhesi party and leaders, they have many sectarian policies. They, for the identity, they want to make whole of Tarai one province or two provinces, which is which will not help keep our geographical integrity. That's why the common people of Tarai, actually especially the Madhesi people, means the Madhesi island people of Tarai, they should be provided their identity through the constitution. Constitution should acknowledge that the Madhesi are the indigenous people of Nepal, because it is so in the history. And other people too, they have not got this acknowledgement by the constitution. But the leaders, they have their the demands are sectarian, and these demands are not in the national interest and in national unity, and for the strengthening of independence and geographical integrity of Nepal. We are not for them. So now the question is there about the federal system. If we can build a federal system which will conform our realities, it will help prosper Nepal, and it will help build Nepal strong. But if we do not have nowadays the federal system which has been accepted by the constitution, it has many shortcomings, and our political culture is not also good. That's why the federal system is facing many questions, and nowadays people have day after day, they are becoming, they are criticizing this system, the new system, and this must be, the people's demands should be addressed, and we should try to make the federal system which will conform our internal reality as well as our international relations. And last, there is one question it is also an secular part. Actually, Nepal has 3 or 4 major religions: Hindu religion, Buddhist one, Kirat religion, and other, the natural religions. And for the 2 or 3 centuries, there are Muslim also in Nepal. Actually, in our opinion, government should not be tied with any religion. And but in our society, the state must be dealing with the religion. But in our peculiar situation, especially the CPML, I think that we should not insert this word, the secular word in our constitution, because it has been, misused by many ill-intentioned organization and power to have some develop some the conflict among the people. That's it. The Nepal is a multi-religious country. It is the country is very much very tolerant society, and it must have freedom of religion. It is well enough, and nothing should be written in the constitution which will give opportunity for the negative forces to sow discord among the people. This is our opinion. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to take another small set. We'll take maybe 2 more questions, and then we want to have some closing remarks. So I know Nachket wanted to ask a question. Any more hands? Okay, we'll do in the front, and
There's 2 more.
Okay, we can do. Okay, we'll do all of them in a stack. No problem.
Namaskar, pranam, aap sabko. My name is Nachket. I study at AU, and I work with the Ministry of External Affairs in India. And yeah, I really appreciated Mr. Ambassador's comments on the trilateral, like the idea of cooperation between India, Nepal, and China. And for the first time in a long time, the CPN assigned Mr. Acharya as like the ambassador to India. So I was wondering if you guys had any thoughts on him. And my second question was about, you can see an increasing persecution of like the People's Liberation Army in India, or like the Naxalites as they're called. And I was wondering if you guys had any thoughts on that, because the CPN has had like a long history of solidarity with them. Yeah.
Thank you. I think up here in the front. Oh, my dress. Thank you, our my brother Eugene.
Hello, thank you so much for speaking with us. I'm Ariana. I study at GW. My question is just a general question. What is Nepal's relationship with Palestine on the world stage? And
your relationship with Nepal's relationship with Palestine.
Yes. So, what's your view of the relationship and the struggle that Palestinians face today?
Hi there. This question is mainly directed towards General Secretary Mainali. Basically on what steps you believe Nepal needs to go through to preserve and maintain and grow the socialist project in Nepal, either more broadly or a Marxist-Leninist perspective specifically.
Good afternoon. My name is Sean. I'm also a student from People's Republic of China. So I have one question. On your Nepal stance on the challenges to international socialism movement, especially to PRC. As General Secretary has pointed out, the existing trade war, it seems like the United States is not satisfied with the fact that we have not given up socialism, and the United States wants to exacerbate the existing conflict and try to challenge the success of socialism in China. So I wonder what is Nepal's stance on this issue, and if any assistance or solidarity movement, what is your party's next actions to take? Thank you much.
Thank you, everyone who asked a question. Now we'll ask each one of our speakers to briefly answer one of the questions, and then
So each
go on to closing remarks.
one of the questions, and then we'll just, because we'll try to wrap up in about 10 minutes.
So far, Nepalese, actually towards Palestinians is concerned, progressive Nepali people support Palestinians' cause for their independent identity. There is a separate Palestinian state. But our old previous governments and even present government, they have very good relation with Israel. Sometimes little for Israel. There was Nepalese army agreement for parachute training, semi-air force training. So far, but official line was adopted by Parliament, and as a Parliament, and what we pleaded is that we should recognize Israel and Palestinian states both, and better they coexist and not to enter into conflict. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, the question from India, I couldn't hear his name. But actually we too want there must be cooperation among Nepal, China and India. And in the state level, you know, we are for this non-aligned and peaceful relation, as well as we observe these Panchashila principles, and we are very much concerned about the geopolitical balance relations. And we want to have a good relation with India. We want every time that India, honor our, that means Nepal's independence, our, the sovereignty as well as our political, our geographical integrity. And there must be, the equality among both nations. There are so many things which are not, where the Nepal is being cheated or discriminated by South. And apart these things, we have good relation with Indian people and the authorities. Second one, how to build socialism. Yeah, right now, in our opinion, Nepal right now is not in the stage of building socialism. Still we have to fight against the remnants of feudalism. We have this compared capitalism. We don't have enough, developed national capitalism in Nepal. And right now we have to build a national capital, as well as the people's capital generated through the many small entrepreneurs. And that's why we call it a social capital. The time is to build a social capitalism in Nepal. And it will make a right situation where we can start building socialism. But the question is not of the present day. And one very important question from the friend from People's Republic of China. So long as the relation between government to government relation is concerned, so we have been in good relations since 1956. And both countries will abide by this, Panchashil, we abide by this, the non-alignment policy. And China has always honored our independence and sovereignty and our territorial integrity. We are very much obliged to her. And Nepal has is trying its best to observe this one China policy. We are not for free Tibet or one China, two orbit policy. We are not for it. We have one China policy, and on that respect we have good relation, and China has been showing its good sentiments towards the development of Nepal also. Actually, China, the Chinese people fought for more than 3 decades for the emancipation of China under the leadership of Mao Zedong, and they are People's Republic, and the People's Republic had started the way for socialism, socialism, and after the 1980s, under the principle of theory of Deng Xiaoping and other leaders, China is trying to build its socialism, having its own characteristics, and they have achieved tremendous success in this field. They have always good wishes for China, and so long as the party is concerned, we have a technology relation with the CPC, and we wish good for CPC, and we have our support for China's peaceful foreign policy. And I think that's why the Nilamba Acharya was the one member of the permanent group instituted between Nepal and India. But it was a joint venture accepted by government of India and government of Nepal also. But they have prepared their report. But the government of India is not willing to accept the report. The report was unanimously made to reform the anomalies in the relation of Nepal-India relation. But very sorry that it has not been accepted by the government of India. And his appointment, I think, is welcome for us also. Thank you.
I think we're getting close to ending here. I wanted to say a few closing words, especially for those from the United States. And again, we want to thank the Internationalist Student Front here at George Washington University. Very unique program, because where else have we had a chance to hear the genuine leaders from Nepal come and speak? It's a great contribution, so let's give them a round of applause. Anne-Marie in particular, who's done so much work. Here to make this possible. This has gone on for a couple months to organize an event like this, and for our guests who have come all the way from Nepal to participate, really something. I want to go back to where I started in the beginning of the program regarding the international environment, and especially what the United States government is doing regarding People's Republic of China, it has an obvious impact on all of its neighbors, including Nepal, including India, including all of the people in Asia, but I would say ultimately for people everywhere, including people right here in the United States. The reason the United States government considers China's peaceful rise to be an existential threat to the United States government is not because China poses a military threat to the United States or to the people here. China is not about to invade any part of the United States. China doesn't have military bases surrounding the United States. China does not have tactical nuclear weapons in close-by countries pointed at the United States. On the other hand, the United States, through the so-called Asia pivot, is doing just that towards the People's Republic of China. When Mike Pence came to attend a conference his plane came within a few miles of territory that China claims in the South China Sea. He said this was a freedom of navigation exercise. Whenever you hear the United States government talk about freedom of navigation, when the U.S. Navy has all of the aircraft carriers and battle destroyer groups prowling the seven seas, we have to recognize that for what it is. That's a euphemism which says basically to China and to the world, don't you dare try to prevent or present yourself in any way as an obstacle to the complete global domination of the United States government and the Pentagon in all areas, including the areas that surround your own country. Don't you dare, China, pretend that you have sovereignty in the South China Sea, as if the Pacific Ocean belongs to the United States, as if the Pacific Ocean is just an American lake, like Lake Ontario or Lake Erie. China constitutes this existential threat, not because China is being aggressive, but as China grows economically and retains the fundamental essence of the socialist government that was established with the Chinese Revolution, that constitutes, in the eyes of the United States, a fundamental threat. The United States government actually wants to overthrow the government of China. It wants to carry out regime change in China. It wants to dismember China. You think that's not possible? The Soviet Union was a multinational, multi-ethnic, multi-religious country. In 1991, when it was broken up after decades of extreme pressure, the Soviet Union not only lost its socialist government, but the Soviet Union as a country was broken up. The Baltics, gone. Ukraine, gone. The Caucasus, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and then Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, the entire multinational republic broken up. That made the American government very happy, because the U.S. then felt a new era we were entering a new era of unipolar global domination because the Soviet Union was gone. But China, to their surprise, has not only grown as an economic power, but retained the Communist Party of China in power. As Mike Pence said, we were shocked. We thought when China entered the World Trade Organization that it would have real freedom, meaning that the Communist Party would be overthrown. But instead, China has played by the rules of the global capitalist economy. It's growing, it's stronger, and the Communist Party and the Socialist Project have not been overthrown. And that's what makes the United States think China is a fundamental threat. Not because it's an aggressive threat, but because it exists as it said it would exist starting in 1949. We, the people of the United States, have to support our brothers and sisters in Nepal when they try to exercise self-determination. Do they want socialism? Yes. Do they have the full basis for socialism? Not yet. They're trying to develop the basis for socialism. That's a long, complicated process. But the most important thing for us as Americans is to tell the government that speaks in our name that you don't speak actually for us when you try to stop China or Nepal or India or any country from actually becoming a self-determining force for their own people, their own region. That's our obligation, is to stand up to the U.S. government and expose their lies, and they really are lies about China, Nepal, and India. We have to expose their lies. And the other thing that we have to do is continue to build this kind of program, like the Internationalist Student Front has helped us build, which is let the American people learn about Nepal themselves, not through reading State Department communiques. Let the American people learn about China and India. That's what we have to do. We have to overcome the profound ignorance in the United States, which is not simply because the American people are dumb. It's because The American corporate-owned media and the government want the American people not to know what's going on in the world. So we have to tell the truth. We have to build solidarity, and we have to hear from the people who are, in fact, in the crosshairs of the U.S. That's why this program is so important. So as we wrap up, I think people should stay and talk amongst themselves. There's literature tables at the back. Get literature, meet other friends, join organizations, become part of this progressive movement.
Thank you everybody for joining us today. As Brian mentioned, we are selling literature outside in the back. Feel free to stay and chat, and we thank you all so much for your support. Have a great afternoon.
Yo,